Good evening, all. The Trivandrum branch of the All India Anglo-Indian Association is happy to host a series of webinars. The topic for today is art appreciation. And I'm proud to present our very own Vice President, Ms. Maya Gomez, as our speaker this evening. Ms. Maya Gomez is an architect and planner with an interest in art. She has worked in India and Singapore and currently runs a private architecture practice in Trivandrum. Her research work, Participatory Design Aid, won the National Award from the Indian Institute of Architects in 2002 in the research category. She is active in voluntary service, teaching English and art to students of government schools. She taught the Cambridge IGCSE Art and Design course at L'École Chempaka and has held 2 exhibitions of her artwork. Maya, this platform is all yours.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you to the All India Anglo-Indian Association of Trivandrum for this lovely platform. Thank you to all of you who have tuned in on time. And I'll start without much ado. So let me start. Of course, the story of art is a very long one. It is as old as the history of humanity itself. But let me start with the Renaissance man. We have to start somewhere. So I think that is as good a place to start as any other. So all of you have heard of the Renaissance man. The Renaissance man is somebody who was considered to be an expert at various fields, and the ones who come to mind, and prolific as well in all these fields, across fields. So of course the ones who come to mind are Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Now we know that Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were very inventive for their time and very skilled and prolific in various fields. And they were the epitome of the Renaissance movement, which started in Italy in the 15th century. So we're talking about the 1400s. I'd like you all to travel back with me to the 1400s, Italy. Now, okay, just a little break. I'd just like to tell you all that I'm going to ask you a few questions at the end of this. And there's a little quiz, and whoever can answer correctly is going to get a little present from me by and by. So do tune in and listen carefully. So anyway, so going back to the Renaissance man in Italy in the 14th century or the 15th century, the 1400s, what was happening in Italy at the time? What was it that was so special about Italy to give the world such a prolific amount of art and sculptures and architecture, music and literature? Was it something in the air, or was it something in the soil? Well, it was really the simple fact that art was patronized at the time. If you all remember the period of time when The Merchant of Venice, the play by Shakespeare, was set, he was also incidentally belonged to the Renaissance period. The merchants of Venice were very active in mercantile and trading activity. Florence was a center of trade and mercantile activity. It was a very prosperous place. And for this reason, there were a lot of patrons of art as well. And they had a very interesting system of apprenticeship, where young men were sent in to apprentice under master craftsmen and learn and pick up a trade. So universities at the time, the very word university meant universal, and they got a base in theology, philosophy, and science. And once they had that base, they could then go out and apprentice under any master to pick up any trade that they liked. And this is why we saw a flourishing of art in the period. And those of you who have visited Florence will know that you can still see all the wonderful artwork that emanated out of there and then spread to the rest of Europe. But if you look at the 14th, 15th centuries, and the Renaissance period actually stretched up to the 17th century. If you look at that time, you will wonder why the word Renaissance was used, because the word Renaissance is a French word which actually means rebirth or revival. So what were they trying to revive? Well, to understand this, we have to go many, many centuries back to the beginning of the ancient Greece, the civilization in Greece, the ancient civilizations of Greece, and this is going back to the beginning of the millennium. And we have to go back to, say, probably the 8th century BC, right up to probably the 6th century AD. And that was the time when the Greco-Roman world had captured the Roman Empire had spread, and the Greco-Roman world was at its peak. And Greece, ancient Greece, is considered the cradle for modern civilization as the Western world knows it. So whatever we have today in modern civilization, all our ideas of politics, of art, of philosophy, came from ancient Greece. Be it the philosophers, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, be it the Pythagoras, the mathematicians, be it the artists of the time, the sculptures, everything that happened in ancient Greece was considered to be the height of civilization. And it is those ideas, even democracy, it is those ideas that have percolated down into modern civilization. So the revival or rebirth of this classical period that was seen during the Renaissance is really what was a springboard of a lot of activity in the Western world. Now, also, it coincided, the Renaissance period coincided with the discovery of the printing press at Gutenberg in Germany. And because this was in about 1453, and because the printing press was discovered, there was a lot of material made available freely to the public. Printed material they could read, they could travel, they had a wider understanding, and therefore there was a flourishing of the arts. Now, let us look at, let us move ahead and look at some of the slides and go through these stories one by one. So if we start with the first slide. You can share the first slide. Okay. So if that is the slide on your screen, what you see, I hope you can all see it on your screen. Okay. So we're starting with the Greco-Roman period, of course, and that is the Parthenon, a building in the Acropolis that was considered, throughout civilization, modern civilization, we've gone back to this sort of, there was a revival during the Renaissance and later during the neoclassical time when everybody was going back to the proportions that they used, the kind of detailing that they used. And there was a lot of study of the way we visualized something, which is of course the basis of art. And so here you will see in the next slide that they were very obsessed with proportions, and to such an extent that they had the anatomical details down pat. And if you read that little quote by a writer from 2nd century Greece, he talks about the proportions not of the elements but of the parts, that is to say of finger to finger, all the fingers to the palm and the wrist, these to the forearm to the upper arm, and so on. So they were obsessed with proportions, which form the basis of what you actually visually see. And if we go on to the next slide. Now, what happened between the Greek civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization, and the Renaissance? Well, what happened between that was the medieval period, and that was called the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages were considered by some scholars to be the darker period because they feel there was a big fall after the civilization from the Greek. There was a lot of religious wars, and there were pandemics. We're probably going to, even the bubonic plague, we're probably going through one such right now as well, one such cycle right now as well. And so it was considered to be a period of darkness. But some other scholars, of course, don't agree with this and say that it had its own fair share of inventions and activities happening in that period, which then blended into the Renaissance period. And after the Renaissance period, we had the beginning of the modern civilization as we know it today. So the Renaissance was really a bridge between the medieval period and the modern civilization as we know it today. Now, look at this illustration from the 13th century. It is from a French manuscript. And of course, you know that there were monasteries, and the monks were the ones who were doing all the writing and the studying, and they were the ones who were involved in all the scholarly activities, so to speak. And these were the three classes of people: the monks, the knights, and the peasants. And so that is what the medieval world was all about: the crusades and the fights and the monks doing all the scholarly activities, including winemaking and all of it. And you had the peasant class as well. So the next one. Now, during this time, the Emperor Constantine shifted his capital from Rome to Byzantium, which is the modern day Istanbul, and he renamed it Constantinople. And that was where the Greek Orthodox Church then took root. And as you all know, Byzantine art happened during this era, during the Middle Ages. And Byzantine art was later not looked upon so greatly by the scholars, as they thought that the classical Greek and Roman art had reached a perfection in skill and in anatomy and proportion, which no other art form could attain. And so they felt that the Byzantine art fell short to a large extent. We are all familiar with the icons, the frescoes, and all the rest of the work that was connected with Byzantine art. But however, in the modern time, we are looking at it with fresh eyes, and we realize that there is a lot of beauty in this work as well, because it was quite symbolic. There was a lot of symbolism, as well as there was a kind of a flatness to the way they approached art, which had a little bit of a modern appeal as compared to the classical art forms that we were used to. So if you look at this slide on your screen, this one is the Christ the Pantocrator. If you look at the right and the left, you might think it's a very simple image, but there is a lot of symbolism here, because the right side of it is slightly different from the left. And if you look at the next slide, see the right slide, in the next slide, we've mirrored both the images. So you can see if the right is taken mirrored, it is different from the left. And this shows the two dualities in Christ, the human and the divine. And so there was a lot of symbolism in this art, of course. And if you go to the next icon, that is of the Annunciation, and that is of Angel Gabriel. And all these were also done on the walls with mosaics. So they use they use gold, they use precious stones, and they use all this. Now, the idea of art in those times was, of course, to make the common man, or the person who saw this artwork, get into a state of veneration and understand, have a connect with the artwork, and through that have a spiritual connect. Now, even today, that is really the pursuit of the artist. The artist is still trying to connect with the viewer on a slightly higher plane or on a spiritual level, and trying to connect to make the viewer go into something that is higher than himself. And this has always been sort of the motive of art, even when it had a openly religious or mythological aspects to it. And even today in the abstract art, that is what artists are actually trying to do, to have a moment where the viewer and the viewed become one. Now, if we look at the next slide, of course, the Islamic world then took over the Constantinople, and it came under Islamic rule. And even the Islamic art drew a lot from Byzantine art, because the mosaics that were used in Islamic art, although they could not use figures or living figures, they could still use geometrical patterns. And eventually the Byzantine artisans were used to do some of the mosaic work that you see on the slide, which had just natural elements, but later this evolved into more geometric patterns, which was seen in later mosques all across the world, in fact. And of course, they were also good at tapestries and woven silk rugs. Next one. This is the Bayeux tapestry from the 11th century. So this is another reason that art was used. Now this one is a 70-meter long tapestry. It's actually an embroidery work, not really a woven work, but it has survived to this date, and it tells the story of the Battle of Hastings. So this was another reason why art was commissioned by kings. They wanted to tell stories of their battles. They wanted to make it visual. So this was a sort of a graphical, like a comic, you know. You could go through all the stages of how the battle happened. So it was a graphical representation of an event. And this was another reason art was used at the time. But of course, all these things lose their relevance over time, because over time, as we were able to print and to photograph, we then did not need such methods of recording events anymore. So everywhere in the world, even if you look at the Mahabalipuram temples from about the same time, the 8th to 10th century, you see a lot of artwork and bas-relief sculptures that show you events that happened at the time, conquests and other events. It gives you a window into what really happened. In Hampi, you have the old Rama temple, which has the whole Ramayana story depicted around it. So if a devotee just walked around, they could see the whole story unfold through sculpture, through art, when they didn't really have the text to read it or to understand it. So this was also a reason why art was used in the past. Next one. So these are the Ajanta and Ellora cave frescoes. These were from from 2nd century to the 3rd century BC. And these frescoes, these were like the paintings done by the artists in the Byzantine era as well, in the Middle Ages by the monks on the walls of monasteries. It was similar to that, but these have a very highly emotive quality, and they're also very highly skilled. And therefore, these were considered as a kind of a touch point for Indian artists, for modern Indian artists, because modern Indian artists didn't consider the Western school to be their base, although they learned in that tradition, and we still continue to learn art in the tradition of the Western world. They still didn't consider that to be their base that they could identify with. And therefore, when they were looking for something within India, this is one of the points that the modern artists from India went back to, and that is the frescoes in the Ajanta and Ellora caves. Now, the next one. These were the old mandala paintings or mandala tapestries that were found in Tibet and the other Buddhist areas. These two, it was across religions. It was across Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. The mandalas had within them a certain kind of a ritualistic or a quality where they say that the viewer of this mandala, it actually represented various realms, and it represented various worlds. And they could say that it held the secrets which could again draw the viewer into a higher realm or into a spiritual realm. So that was also another reason for art to be done. The next slide, we come to the 15th, 16th centuries, again back to the Renaissance period. We're traveling back there where we started. And here the Italians, of course, this was again under the Italians, and they had this particular technique called chiaroscuro. Chia means light and oscuro means shadow. And so if you look at all the paintings of that era, which drew from ancient classical Greek and Roman forms and anatomy and the studies of that, you will see that they're all composed with light and shadow. So they're very, very dark undertones into which these forms of light were captured. So that was the process by which these paintings were made, by actually capturing dark undertones and then putting in figures in the light. So it was called a chiaroscura process. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci took this one step further with his, if you look at his Mona Lisa, you will see there's a kind of a smoky effect. And that's what it was called. It was called fumato or fumto. Fumto is a word that literally means smoke-like. And so he had the smoke-like effect by various layers of paint, laboriously added layer upon layer inside a studio, and worked on laboriously to get this particular effect in the painting. So it was a highly skilled way of working. And Michelangelo's sketches in the Sistine Chapel were almost lifelike in their accuracy of anatomical detail. They were so lifelike. And Michelangelo, of course, being a Renaissance man, he straddled across all kinds of art. There was sculpture, that's the Pieta, and that is the dome that he designed for the Basilica. And he was in art, architecture, mathematics, just like his contemporary Leonardo. And of course, they looked back at the classical Greek Romans. So the Parthenon was considered the greatest example of proportion, and it was called the golden ratio. And there are a lot of studies done to show that the golden ratio, which is of course the number pi, and in mathematics, and it shows that this is the best ratio that you can have. Like those of you who have taken photographs will also know about the composition rule of thirds, where you have something, you divide your frame into 3 parts, and you have something on the third. And so this is similar to that. It's a kind of a way of dealing with proportion and how you see things, which makes a composition visually pleasing. And so there were a lot of studies done on the golden ratio during the Renaissance, and not only during the Renaissance, because if we see later, now this is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. It's called the Vitruvian Man, and it's a study of proportions based on the human form. And the one next to it is the study of proportions based on the human form by Le Corbusier, who was a modern architect, a French Swiss architect, of course. And Corbusier also devised a whole system of proportions based on the modular man. So it was not just the Renaissance people who went back to look at classical Greek and Rome. Even the modernists, although they rejected anything to do with classicism, took the basic fundamentals from there. Next one. And here you can see Da Vinci's prolific sketches of the human body. He studied medicine, he looked at anatomy in great detail, he looked at so many aspects of, he was inventive, he invented a lot of machines and the rest of it. And there is a picture of Corbusier with his modular man. Some of the buildings done by Corbusier, you will see that the proportions are so wonderful. They just look so pleasing. And any modern architect who tries to copy the style but misses out on those proportions is just losing the whole meaning of the whole thing, really. So that's Unité de Habitation in France, which was one of his one of the first apartment buildings, which allowed people to live stacked one on top of the other, but also allowed prefabrication and allowed a modular kind of design to happen. It was the pioneering building at the time. And the rest of them are in Chandigarh, of course, because Nehru invited him to Chandigarh to design the city. And these are some of the public buildings he designed in Chandigarh. This is back to Da Vinci. You will see that in Italy, in classical Greece, it was not just proportions that they had a handle over, it was also perspective. They understood depth of field and perspective so well, to such an extent that they were so obsessed with visuals that they had something called entasis, which is a correction of columns. Like, for example, in the Parthenon, if you see all these columns lined up, when you look at them, your eye tends to make them it doesn't see them as straight, but it tends to make them bend inwards, similar or bend outwards. And similarly, the eye tends to see, when a lot of columns are together, it tends to see them slenderer in the middle. And so these optical illusions itself were corrected by the artists in such a way that the columns were given a slight swelling in the middle, and they were tilted slightly inwards so that the optical illusion was corrected. So can you imagine the amount of effort and pain they took to study how one perceives something, how one sees something, perspective, and the rest of it, to correct their buildings to such an extent. And in this figure of the Last Supper, you'll see how Da Vinci has used perspective again. You'll see the room drawing backwards into one point. It's a one-point perspective. But later, the modern artists were beginning to reject this way of painting because they felt that the canvas is actually flat. And if your canvas is flat, why should you show a depth? Why should you show an illusionary depth? You shouldn't be doing that. You should be opening out your visual and flattening it onto the canvas. So that was their reaction in later years to this particular way of looking at perspective. Caravaggio is another painter who took, Renaissance painter, who took this chiaroscuro to its ultimate limit, where you see the shadows, deep shadows, and the figures are caught like in a shaft of light. They're caught in a shaft of light, and it's a kind of a drama, and the viewer is drawn to engage in this drama that is happening. So now, after this period of chiaroscuro, and when paintings were looking more and more realistic, what had to happen? The invention of photography had to happen. So the invention of photography happened in 1839, and in 1839, is it on me? Okay. So the invention of photography happened, and therefore all these forms of painting became irrelevant because you could capture it all in a photograph. Portraits, for example, became irrelevant. Taking a still life, for example, drawing a still life became irrelevant. So all these things became irrelevant when photography came into the scene. And so then the question that artists faced was, why be so realistic? Why try to capture such accurate detail when it can be done well enough by a photograph? So what really is the work of an artist? Where does an artist stand in this new realm where photography has come in? And also there were new brilliant colors that were invented, and they could be taken out of the studio, and art could be taken out into the open air. So when art was taken into the open air, what could happen is that artists could quickly capture a view, say, of a changing period in the morning. Before the sunlight changed, they could quickly capture a view by the use of colors. This quickness meant that they were not laboring in the studio over chiaroscuro and over sfumato, but they were just quickly capturing views that with spontaneity. And so spontaneity came into art, and that started the movement called Impressionism. Now, Impressionism started where they said that, look, let's just put blobs of paint onto a paper, onto a canvas, let the strokes be seen, and let it not be blended and fussed over, but let the whole picture come to life in that kind of spontaneity. So this is how Impressionism came into being, and that is Claude Monet's painting, famous painting, which was called. Now we are shifting our place, in fact, from Italy to France, because the Impressionist movement then started in France. I must tell you that art never happened in isolation with one genius thinking of something overnight. It is a long process that always happened with groups of people coming together, having thoughts, writing about it, thinking about it, discussing politics, discussing the relevance, discussing technique, discussing processes, and then coming up with something new. And so this group of Impressionist painters met in France, and Impressionism took root in France, and they had their first exhibition And this was the painting that was put up by Claude Monet. And at the time, it was scoffed at because the people who looked at it and who felt they had a very good taste in art thought that it was incomplete and that it was just very hastily done. But you will understand how this shook up the art world because it was a very new way of looking at color and technique. So what they did is they the Impressionists really took black out of the scene, and all the shadows that they did were the complementary colors. And they used a lot of white as well. So there was a very bright and more shimmery effect. And also you could see the brush strokes. They were not worked over and, worked over with many layers. Rather, you could see the brush strokes that were actually applied. Now, to be able to do this level of art, you really had to know what you were doing because you couldn't go over it again and again. You just had to finish it as soon as, so you had to know your light, you had to understand your light and shadow, you had to understand your form. And this is, of course, the color theory that developed at this time. This is a very basic color wheel to just show you that the three primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, which are placed farthest apart on the wheel. The primary colors and then the secondaries, which you got by mixing the primaries. And what they did is take the complementary, like the complementary of red would be found right across from it, which is green. And those complements would be used for shadows, not black. So what happened is tones of the complements. So what happened is if you had blue, if you had sunrise in yellow, you would shade it in blue. The shadows would be shaded with the complement blue. If you had orange, then you would shade it, orange shaded with blue and yellow shaded with violet. And that's how and you'll see that in all Impressionist paintings. This was because of the new understanding of color theory. And when something new comes like that comes into the picture, artists cannot be forced to work in an old style because they know something new and they can't unknow it. And they have to keep moving forward. And that is how new movements come about. And so here we see the new Impressionists who go into small points of color, small points of shimmery color placed against each other, the complement placed against the color to achieve this beautiful illuminated quality in their painting. And Georges Seurat also was a famous Impressionist, and these paintings are studied a lot as having been a turning point in the way color was used and perceived. Renoir was also an Impressionist, and Renoir captured these very spontaneous looking active scenes, but in a very spontaneous manner, which is very different from the old style of painting. Mary Cassatt, one of the few women painters of the time, the Impressionist, who was very famous. She was American. She came to Paris. Unfortunately, she couldn't join the Paris school because they were not taking women. So women had to learn by private tutors at home. And she had very interesting compositions. And as you can see, she began to use flat color. She was not shading it too much. Or it was a slight move towards modernism that you see in her work. And she also tried to engage the viewer. Now, most painters, artists would try to engage their viewer in various ways. And one very recurring theme you see is the mother and the child. She's done a series of mother and child because we can all identify with it. What an artist tries for is to get the viewer to become engaged with the work and to feel something within them. And mother and child is definitely a theme that everyone can relate with in some way or the other. And this is one theme that she explored a lot, despite her modernist tendencies. Van Gogh was a post-impressionist, and Van Gogh took the brush strokes one step further by adding a certain rhythm into them. So you can see how the brush strokes are actually moving. You can see them forming a pattern and a rhythm. And this was one of his famous works where you see the rhythm in the skies and you see the rhythm of the actual individual strokes. That was also a very new way of looking at art. And this at about that time, there were a lot of Japanese woodcuts available in Europe. And Japanese art and architecture influenced the Europeans to big extent, because there was a very modernistic simplicity. Because of the Zen philosophy, there was a kind of a quality to the Japanese art which made them look at compositions also in a newer way, and made them look at, and most of them have written about it a lot, including Van Gogh. Most of these artists were also prolific writers, and Van Gogh has written letters to his brother in which he talks about his Japanese influence, which you can see in some of his work. Now, after Van Gogh, we had the, or probably like overlapping, there were the Fauves. Now, Fauvism came about. It was, Fauve, of course, in French means wild beast. And any artist who was, of course, was trying to, the artists who were trying to create something new were always looked upon with disdain. And the Fauves actually used color in a very different way. So as you can see in these early paintings, Henri Matisse and André Derain, these paintings that they did in which they used color very, very differently. Now, of course, there was no real necessity for portraits as such, because we had photography. And what would make a painting different? What could an artist really contribute? So they started looking at color in a very different way. And then you see the kind of move towards the modern movement here now. We take a break now. I just like a little feedback. Is this going too fast, too boring? How is it? You'll have to unmute.
Yeah, this is Rex.
Yes.
It's very interesting. You structured it well. You're giving the periods of art, which is very, very important, starting with the Greco-Roman culture. And I'm finding it very interesting because to me, it's a revision of having seen a lot of this in Europe when I was there, visiting all these art museums. And it is very, very enlightening what you're throwing in, especially about the color combinations and the type of art. It's very interesting. Yeah, and it's very historical. It is very historical, and that I appreciate it greatly. You've done a lot of research. You've done a lot of research.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
So I'll also ask you all 2 questions at this point. These are my quiz questions. The first question is, can you name the man that was done by Leonardo da Vinci, and it was considered for proportions? Can you name that particular man that he drew to show the proportions of the human figure? Can anybody take that question?
Vitruvius.
Very good. Who was that?
Jessel.
Wonderful, Jessel, the Vitruvian man. Excellent. I have one more question. I'm noting your name, Jessel.
But she didn't give the name.
It's coming to you. And there's one more question. Which painting by Claude Monet gave a whole art movement its name? Which was the painting by Claude Monet, which lent its name to a whole movement in art? He was a French painter.
Impressionist.
Very good. Impression Sunrise. Excellent. The painting itself was called Impression Sunrise. It was a quick impression he caught of a sunrise in a very spontaneous manner. But the movement was called Impressionism, the movement that came out of it. Okay, so shall we move on to the next slide? Okay, I request you all to mute your mics and we're moving back to the next slide. So after Impressionism, now Impressionism also started to get boring for many artists, because although it was a new way of applying paints and a new technique of actually looking at color theory and being more spontaneous, the themes that they looked at were still themes that could be photographed. It was landscapes, it was the sunrise, it was views of people and activities that were happening, but these were still themes that could easily be photographed. So artists wanted something more out of their work. They wondered what their relevance was, and they wanted something more. And therefore, they turned to the movement. We slowly see a movement called Expressionism coming in, where they want their work to actually express something. And if you look at this painting by Edvard Munch from 1893, it is called The Scream. You must remember that the Industrial Revolution had happened, and the world was changing. It was urbanized. And there is this man standing there. He's almost an abstract man. He's not really a fully detailed man. And you can see he's screaming, and it's an inward scream. He's holding his ears. The scream is inside. Nobody can hear him. It's almost an urban angst. And you can see that angst in the way the background is done, those lines on the sky coming down into the sea, that whole feeling of emotion, you can see it in the nature. And if you see the eye is being led by those rays onto the two figures at the back who are almost nonchalant, they don't care for this man who is just screaming. They're going about with their regular life. It was such an arresting painting, with so simply done, but conveying so much of emotion at that point of time when the world was facing this change and urban life was becoming a reality. It was such an arresting painting, and this was one of the touchstones when Expressionism started to happen and people started to look at how can art express something more than just landscapes? How can it express emotions as well? And then slowly we see that artists are also tending to look at the flatness of the canvas more. And they're saying, look, our canvas is flat. We should be opening up forms and spreading them out on this flat canvas. We should be responding honestly to the flatness of the canvas. Why should we try to make something look like it has depth when the canvas is actually flat? It's false. A photograph can capture that depth, but why should our canvases have to reflect that depth when depth doesn't really exist on a flat canvas? And so the Cubists started looking at works by earlier painters like Paul Cézanne, which is what you see on your screen. Cézanne was already kind of experimenting with his form in a very different way. He was already kind of breaking up his forms. And then you have the movement called Cubism, and of course Pablo Picasso came onto the scene. He was so prolific, and now in order to be able to take apart form and reassemble it on a flat canvas, you really have to be a master of form if you don't understand form in all its aspects. Now, what the Cubists essentially said is, if you're looking, say, at a portrait of a person, why should you be just looking at it from the front? The canvas is flat. You could open it out. You could look at the side. You could look at the back. You could look at various aspects. You could scan the image from various viewpoints. Why would you have to just look at it from the front? We are not a box camera, are we? We are humans who can respond with our intellect to a flat canvas. And so that's how they started looking at form. And remember that all these artists were trained in the formal, ancient, classical style of painting. Their training was there. They had that base, and they painted in that way as well. But there was something in them that just didn't want to comply to that old style, that did not hold their attention or the attention of the world anymore, didn't make them relevant anymore. And so some of his early works, you'll see this composition of the guitarist. I mean, it's such a brilliant composition, even if you look at it, the diagonal of that guitar, which is kind of perpendicular to the diagonal of that leg that's crossed, and then the straight body and the tilted neck. The way that whole form is composed on that canvas, it's just pure brilliance. It's an understanding of the compositional elements that you see in this painting. If you go to the next one, this is called Three Musicians. And I mean, for somebody to come up with something like this, you can look at the three musicians there, one in white, one in that checked peach and yellow, and one in the black cloak. But how would you put together forms of such beautiful colors that all work together so brilliantly, textures that work together so brilliantly, and created something so compositionally wonderful, you know? And it would take a genius to do something like this. And he was so prolific and he influenced a whole slew of people after him who could not see art the same way ever again. That is his painting of Guernica, which is the Spanish Civil War. And you can see how various elements that happened in the war showed, you know, the screaming faces, the neighing horse, the bull, the raging bull, arms and limbs asunder. But they've all come together brilliantly in a composition which kind of reads together as a whole. These are not fragmented parts. They're all reading together, and the different tones that are used. He hasn't used color here because his focus is on form. And the way he's blended all those disparate elements into one dynamic painting, which takes us back to the Civil War, is quite fantastic. So that's Cubism. Move towards abstraction. So after this, we had a move towards abstraction. Now, abstraction, if you can read this quote by Mark Rothko. We are for flat forms because they destroy illusion and reveal truth. So we need to understand where these artists were coming from. We need to understand what the thought process was, what was the context, what was the politics at the time, to understand where they were coming from. Mark Rothko also painted in the formal style initially, but then we saw it changing. This is a slow swirl at the edge of the sea. This is one of his paintings. And then he moved on to pure color fields, just these large canvases of color. And at that time, it must have been such a revelation to some people, because in fact, you know, you have these stuffy museums where you go and stand and look at all the formal aspects of paintings, and then suddenly you encounter this large canvas of just pure color in front of you. And it must have been so stunning. There were people who in fact wept in front of his paintings with a magnanimity of what struck them, that this could be art, you know. And so of course, again, we have to look back at he was mainly concerned with the viewer's experience, the merging of the work and the recipient beyond verbal comprehension. So there again, it's a kind of a spiritual element in art that even abstract and modern painters were looking for across the spectrum. This is a work by an artist called Piet Mondrian. Now, Piet Mondrian is also a very famous artist in the modern movement. For different reasons, which I'm coming to. This was one of his earlier works where he just looks at a tree and look at the way he has studied the form of a tree, the way his lines swirl, and the pure beauty of that whole thing. And here he moved into minimalism. Now, minimalism argued that extreme simplicity could capture the sublime representation that art requires. So it was a paring down to basics. Minimalism was cutting off everything, shaving off everything that they felt was in excess, and paring it down to basics. And they became kind of obsessed with a very basic aesthetic. And so when you shave down everything, what are you left with? And remember, these artists also wrote a lot. So they've left behind a whole body of work about their thoughts. And in fact, the modern movement was mainly an intellectual movement more than anything else. And that is Piet Mondrian's famous series of works that he did with just the three primary colors. So the three primary colors are red, blue, and yellow, and all other colors are got by mixing these three primaries. So there he was taking this to an extreme and using just straight lines and primary colors. And of course, these Mondrian prints became very famous in fashion, and everywhere people started adopting these and using it. So it's a very well-known print because it's used everywhere in the world. It's become a cultural icon of sorts. But imagine going into a large room and seeing this huge canvas of just red, blue, yellow, composed so brilliantly, and just staring at you. It would be such a lovely sight. And so a lot of artists, even to this day, use these three primary colors in their work when they want to get sort of capture the viewer. This painting by Piet Mondrian is called the Broadway Boogie Woogie. You can almost see the lights on the sidewalk, you know. You can almost see, you could perceive it to be a map of sorts of a neighborhood in Broadway, and you could almost see the sidewalk lights in it. This artist is Paul Klee. And Paul Klee was very active in the Bauhaus movement. The Bauhaus was a modern art school in Germany. They taught textile design, art, architecture, and they influenced a whole generation of architects and designers and painters for generations to come. And they're still considered a standard in modern art. And he taught there. He has written a lot too. And if you see, again, Paul Klee is just looking at color. He's using color in very magical ways, breaking it up, fragmenting it, perhaps a hearkening to mosaic art of Leo, but getting to the essence of it. He also used a lot of symbols like this in his work, maybe hieroglyphical sort of symbols. Again, symbols are something we can all relate to, because there's a kind of a primordial sort of aspect to these hieroglyphical symbols. A lot of artists have used this. They don't mean anything, but still they can mean a lot to the viewer because it evokes memories, it evokes half-forgotten ideas, collective consciousness, it evokes all these thoughts. And even K.C.S. Panikkar, the one who started the Cholamandalam Artist Village in Chennai and who influenced so many other artists, modern avant-garde artists in India, including a lot of contemporary artists. He also painted using a lot of symbols in his later work. And in fact, on the right, again, Indian artists were always looking for an identity. And they did not want to really draw from the Western canon, although they were trained in that kind of art. That is the basis of all art training. And so if you see here, this painting on the right is almost like one of those astrological charts, you know, which you get, and so he was going back to some kind of metaphysical representation through symbols. Marc Chagall was a painter who again started playing with how you really perceive things. He would draw you in with these fairy tale like compositions and larger than life figures. And this is the violinist on the roof, of course. And that's another Marc Chagall with floating forms. Here again, instead of just depicting it as a normal scene you could photograph, the artist is trying to give you a sense of emotion and draw you in to that scene. And then we had Vasily Kandinsky coming on. It's very hard for a lot of people to understand. He painted to music, and this was the kind of work that he came up with. Please read that quote of his. Ask yourself if the work has enabled you to walk about into a hitherto unknown world. If the answer is yes, what more do you want? So has this work shaken you out of your complacency and asked you to think differently and walk about into a hitherto unknown world? If yes, that is all it has to matter. Stop thinking. That's what he has said. And with cold eyes and indifferent mind, the spectators regard the work. Connoisseurs admire the skill as one admires a tightrope walker, enjoy the quality of painting as one enjoys a pastry, but hungry souls go hungry away. The herd stroll through the rooms and pronounce the pictures nice and splendid. Those who could speak have said nothing. Those who could hear have heard nothing. So again, art was again a little bit reactionary because they said, what is all this pomposity and this stuffiness over art? What is it that you're trying to analyze so formally? And what is it that you're trying to understand and admire and then follow what the critics are saying and follow where the media leads you? This was also a pomposity that many artists kind of rebelled against and said, look, there are different ways you can actually look at things without the pretenses, you know. Georgia O'Keeffe was one of the leading female artists from America, and she also looked at composition in a very different way. Her paintings were almost abstract. They would zoom in to the details of flowers and the details of elements in nature, and they were almost abstract in their beauty. And she also looked at the way she looked at things was a little different for her time. And then we had the Dada movement. The Dada, as its name suggests itself, was just an irrelevant reaction, irreverent reaction to what was happening after the First World War. We had lost confidence in our culture. We began by shocking common sense, public opinion, education, institutions, museum, good taste, in short, the whole prevailing order. So these were a group of youngsters, and Dada became an international movement. It was centered in Berlin, but it became an international movement. It caught on in New York and in the rest of the world. It was born out of a negative reaction to the horrors of World War I. It rejected reason and logic, prizing nonsense, irrationality, and intuition. So most of the young artists at the time were also looking at a kind of infusing humor into a dull and dreary world, while also giving a strong message that, look, we are not going to take your nonsense anymore. So Marcel Duchamp was one of these. That's a portrait of him, which is called a 5-point perspective. And he put in this fountain, which is, of course, just a urinal. And at the time, it must have been quite, in the Dada time. But of course, a lot of people have tried this, but not so successfully as he did when he first did it. And look at the one next to that, to be looked at from the other side of the glass with one eye close to for almost an hour. I mean, that's the kind of irreverence they had towards how the pomposity that was in the political and the art world at the time. And we also had a metaphysical element to a lot of art at the time. Giorgio Chirico was an Italian who did these huge, stark landscapes, sort of making fun of this classical revivalist movement, which adored all these Roman and Greek big colonnades and buildings and squares and plazas, because he shows the stark emptiness and almost the what is the point of it all kind of questions that arose in his canvases. And his elements were all, it was landscapes which did not really have any life in them, but still there was something or the other happening. It was strongly influenced by his reading of Nietzsche, whose style of writing fascinated him, with suggestions of unseen auguries beneath the appearance of things. So there were a lot of artists during the metaphysical phase who were trying to look for these unseen auguries. Surrealism then came about with artists like Salvador Dali, was the most well-known, but there were many. Of course, the media always had their darlings, and those are the ones we come to know the most of. And all the melting clocks and these dreamlike landscapes started to become more relevant in art because, of course, these are things that you could not photograph. It came from the mind of the artist and the imagination of the artist. Frida Kahlo also did these very surrealistic kind of paintings, but she said they thought I was a surrealist, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams, I painted my own reality. So here again, the focus was more on the persona of the artist rather than the art itself. S.H. Raza was an Indian artist who worked in Paris, he got a scholarship to study in France and he worked there. You see some of his work has a little bit of that harkening back to the old, mandalas and some kind of metaphysical aspects where you see the snake in the circle and the rising sun and the rest of it. You have to show them the next few slides. Yeah. So these were the works of Raza. That's how an artist trained in France would interpret Indian art in the modern ethos. F.N. Souza was another artist from Goa who belonged to the progressive movement of Mumbai, where the modern artists of India were trying to find a voice and an identity of their own. You can see some of his works. They're almost cubist. They look very much like Picasso's work, maybe, but they also have maybe a hearkening to the Byzantine icons and the kind of the kind of visuals he would have been familiar with in the church at the time. Amrita Shergill, she was half Hungarian and also trained in the Western style, but she also was very important in India because she tried to look for an Indian style in painting, and she did a lot of these kind of Indian scenes, and also took a lot of the influence from the Ajanta and Ellora cave frescoes, like did most other modern artists along with her. And then we move on from there. Let's move to the abstract expressionism, where this is art that most of us won't really be able to understand. Jackson Pollock is known for just dribbling paint all over his canvases, almost at a whim, and creating these works of art. But why is it considered to be so important and so groundbreaking? They still sell for millions, his paintings. The reason is that his technique of pouring or splashing liquid household paint enabled him to view and paint his canvas from all angles. It was also called action painting. So here was an artist who was taking the canvas off the easel, throwing it on the floor, suspending himself above it, running around it, dancing around it. So it was a new way of looking at canvas, and it actually opened up a whole new way that contemporary artists could look at art, that the actual making of the art itself was important rather than what was actually made. So performance, kind of a performance art thing came into being, and he liberated contemporary artists and following artists by moving the canvas away from the easel. So if we understand the background and the context and what these people were actually reacting to, or what they were trying to draw their viewers in with, and read up on their writings and their thoughts and the philosophy prevalent at the time, we are better able to get a grasp on why these artists were relevant and why they were considered important in their time. And you also have pop artists like Jeff Koons. I mean, who would consider pop and kitsch to be high art? But, you know, this is a sculpture called the Puppy, which is, you can find it outside the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum. And the second one is a sculpture called the Mummy, the Big Spider. I would have not thought these relevant at all, but when you actually go there and you see this puppy, a dog, made with these flowers that could be changed seasonally, children just enjoy it. People just relate to it, you know. Imagine having a stuffy like statue like of the Pieta, or an equestrian statue, or a lifeless kind of well done statue of a human being, and then just have a puppy. The sheer pop appeal of it is something really fantastic. And even the spider, the mummy, I could see children running around the legs of it, hanging around the legs, taking photographs, people spending time there, interacting with it in such a way. And so then we come to another whole new way of looking at art, which you will see at the Biennales, the installations, where you just walk into a room, you might see a video, some moving picture, you might hear something, you may be able to touch and feel something, you may be able to walk around and experience other things, and you might be able to read something at the same time. So it became art started surrounding you and engaging all your senses. So art will keep on being relevant, and artists will keep on trying to find their truth and their way, and will keep on being voices for society and trying to say something that is relevant and make people think, shake people out of their complacency, whatever it may be. So we'll end with the quote by Vasily Kandinsky again: "Lend your ears to music, open your eyes to painting and stop thinking. Just ask yourself whether the work has enabled you to walk about into a hitherto unknown world. If the answer is yes, what more do you want? So that's it. That's the end. Thank you so much for listening in. Any queries, questions, most welcome. Or if you'd like to add something to what I said, you're most welcome to do so. I have one more question for you. You'll have to unmute yourself. I have one more question for all of you. Which artist used the primary colors as his palette? The primary colors, which modern artist? Does anyone have the answer to that?
Mark Rotado.
Hello, yes?
Mark Rotado. Come on. Mark
No, it wasn't Mark Rosario, no.
Not Rotado, R-O-T-H-E-R-T-O. No.
Mark Rothko? No, it wasn't Mark Rothko. It is a
Claude
name that...
Claude Monet.
No, Claude Monet was the impressionist. He was the impressionist. I'm talking about a modern painter who used just straight lines in black and white and just the three primary colors.
Forgot his name.
Okay, so the answer is yes.
Is it Claude Monet?
Somebody said it.
No.
Somebody said no. Somebody said it.
Somebody said it.
I don't know.
Mondrian?
Yes, it was Piet Mondrian. Who said that? Amazing. It was Piet Mondrian. So if you give me your name, just drop me an email or something.
Hi Maya, can you see
I'll
me?
send you a prize. Yes, I can.
Hi Maya.
Thomas Abraham.
Shireen
Thomas
here.
Abraham.
And I have one more question for you. Which painting, which artist's painting is likely to have inspired the musical The Fiddler on the Roof? The Fiddler on the Roof.
Guitar by Picasso.
It's not Picasso's guitar, but there was actually a painting I showed you which was of a fiddler standing on a roof.
Here.
Really?
It's here.
Yeah, it was by Marc Chagall.
Okay.
All right, so that brings me to the end of the session. Any questions? Anything you'd like to say?
I don't know whether she can see me or not. I joined, I can see her, but I don't know. Hi
And
Maya, can you see me or hear
Yes,
me?
yes, Shireen, I can hear you. Hi.
Okay. Hi, I joined.
Wonderful, wonderful. So shall we call it a day then? Janet, over to you.
Yeah, I request our secretary, Mr. Jessel Rodriguez, to propose the vote of thanks.
Hi everyone, good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, it is my pleasant duty today to propose the vote of thanks. Before I formally go into it, I would like to make a small announcement. Tomorrow, we are having at the same time at 6 o'clock a talk by Mr. Joseph Fernandez. It is on the 5 secrets of Tangasheri. I'm inviting all those who have participated here today to come and attend that talk. And you may also inform your friends who are interested in attending this talk to come and attend. The youth of our country are in fact the backbone for today's program and all the coming programs, because all this is it is on Zoom and all the technical aspects have been looked into. I would like to thank Ryan Gomez for having hosted this online Zoom meeting. Thank you, Ryan, on behalf of the association and all of us gathered here. Next, I would like to thank Maya for this wonderful talk. I can, in fact, read out briefly the comments that have come in. Fantastic presentation. You did a lot of research, spontaneous presentation. That is one. And another friend has said it was an incredible presentation. And then another comment has come, awesome session, Maya. In fact, it was all these and more. Thank you so much, Maya, for this wonderful talk. And a lot of this is very relevant today because you have started from the right from the beginning, from the Greco-Roman period down to the modern era. And as Uncle Rex said, he has visited many museums, and this was in fact very impressive. Thank you, Maya, so much. Then I would finally like to thank all those who attended this meeting. Thank you so much, and for your patient listening. You are a wonderful audience, and there was no disturbance. The meeting went on peacefully without any other hitch. There was no technical problems. For this reason, I would like to thank Ryan Gomez once more. Thank you all for attending this function. This online series will continue, and I hope you will all continue to join, participate, and encourage the speakers and encourage us by your participation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessel.
I can see a few participants from out of Trivandrum. Thank you all so much. Mr. Islam from Calcutta, Mr. Gavin Wilson from Mysore, I think Miss Pereira from, I'm not sure, I know she's from out of Trivandrum, and lots of other friends. Thank you all for joining in. Please try to join us tomorrow, and it's going to be an interesting session. Maya, thank you again. As a lay person, I've understood art more today. Thank you. You've made it so simple. I know it isn't simple, but you've put in a lot of hard work to make us understand. Thank you very much, Maya.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And good night, everybody.
It's been a pleasure. Good night. Good night.
Session.